It was the kind of neighborhood where nothing unexpected ever happened, tucked away in a quiet suburban enclave where everyone's lives were predictable. Each house looked more or less the same, all brick facades with neatly trimmed lawns and matching mailboxes. Neighbors waved and smiled but rarely ventured beyond polite conversation. It was a comfortable life, steady and calm. But sometimes, just sometimes, Sarah felt like she was drowning in that calm. She had married young. Her husband, Mark, was exactly the kind of man her parents had hoped she'd find: responsible, steady, ambitious. He was the kind of man who remembered anniversaries, paid bills on time, and knew how to grill a perfect steak. They'd met in college, fallen in love quickly, and married not long after graduation. A few years later, they moved to this neighborhood and settled into a predictable routine. Mark worked long hours in finance, and she held a part-time job managing social media for a local boutique, allowing her plenty of time to keep the house in order and take care of everything else. It was a good life, Sarah reminded herself, a life many would envy. But then there were the quiet moments when Mark was away at work, the sun dipping below the horizon, casting golden streaks across the sky, that a strange emptiness settled over her. She couldn't quite name it, but it was there, a feeling that something was missing, some spark or thrill she'd never truly experienced. She buried it as best as she could, reminded herself of the many blessings she had. Still, the feeling lingered, tucked away beneath her outwardly content life. That evening, as she finished folding the last of the laundry and placed the basket in the hallway, a knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. The sound was unexpected, almost startling, and she paused, glancing at the clock on the wall. It was after dark, and they rarely got visitors at this hour. Her heart fluttered with an inexplicable excitement. Who could it be? As she walked to the door, she caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror by the entryway, quickly smoothing her hair and straightening her shirt. The slight thrill she felt was absurd. She knew that. But it was a moment of anticipation in a life that rarely saw surprises. She opened the door to find her neighbor, Josh, standing on her front step. He was a relatively new addition to the neighborhood, having moved in a few months ago, and though she'd exchanged friendly waves with him, they hadn't spoken much. He was a bit younger than her, or so she guessed, and he had a certain quiet energy about him that drew people in without him even trying. His dark hair was slightly disheveled, and there was an intensity in his gaze that seemed softened only by the warm smile he offered her. "Hey, Sarah," he greeted, his voice low and smooth. "I'm sorry to bother you so late. I need a bit of help with something, if you're free." Sarah blinked, her mind racing through possible reasons he'd need her help. "Of course," she replied, her voice perhaps a bit too eager. "Is everything okay?" Josh rubbed the back of his neck, looking slightly embarrassed. "Yeah, it's just, well, there's something wrong in the garage. I thought I could fix it myself, but it's proving to be trickier than I expected." He offered a sheepish smile, and she couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy. "Oh, sure," she said, surprising herself with her quick response. "What do you need help with?" "It's probably just easier if I show you," he replied, gesturing toward his house. "I wouldn't normally ask, but I noticed you're good with tools. Saw you fixing that broken gate latch last week." She nodded, a little flustered that he'd noticed something so small. "I'm happy to help," she said, grabbing her keys and stepping outside, closing the door behind her. The night air was cool, with a soft breeze that rustled the trees. She followed him across the lawn and up his driveway, glancing around to ensure no one else was watching. Not that there was anything to hide, she told herself, but still, there was something about slipping out after dark that felt thrilling. They reached his garage, and he unlocked the door, holding it open for her. Inside, the garage was neat and orderly, though clearly a space he used often. Tools hung from a pegboard on the wall, and a motorcycle gleamed in the corner, its chrome reflecting the overhead light. She glanced at it, intrigued she hadn't taken him for the motorcycle type. "It's over here," he said, leading her toward a shelf near the back. "I was trying to fix this old cabinet. It was already falling apart when I moved in, and I figured it would be a good project, but I think I bit off more than I could chew." Sarah examined the cabinet, noting the missing screws and the way the wood had started to splinter in places. "I see what you mean," she said, assessing the situation. "It's definitely seen better days. Do you have a screwdriver?" He nodded, reaching for one on the workbench, and handed it to her. As she took it, their fingers brushed, just for a moment, but it was enough to send a small jolt through her. She pulled her hand back, focusing on the cabinet and willing her thoughts to stay in check. She knelt down, beginning to tighten a few of the loose screws and realign the panels. Josh crouched beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. She tried to focus on the work, but her mind kept drifting to the closeness between them, the way his presence filled the space. "So, how's everything been?" he asked, breaking the silence. "Oh, same old, she replied, smiling despite herself. "It's a quiet neighborhood." "Too quiet sometimes," he said, his tone laced with a hint of mystery. He glanced at her, and she felt her pulse quicken. "I haven't really gotten to know many people here yet. It's nice to have someone willing to help out." She laughed softly. "Well, we're all just neighbors, gotta look out for each other." The silence settled again, but it felt different now, charged, like the air before a storm. She finished tightening the last screw, testing the cabinet door to make sure it was secure. "There," she said, standing up and dusting her hands off. "That should hold for a while." "Thanks, Sarah," he said, his gaze lingering on her. "I owe you one." She shook her head, suddenly feeling shy. "It's nothing, really. Happy to help." As she made her way toward the door, she felt his hand on her shoulder, light and brief, but enough to stop her in her tracks. She turned, looking up at him, and for a moment they stood there, the silence heavy between them. "If you ever need anything, if you ever want some company, or just a break from the quiet," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper, "you know where to find me." She swallowed, her throat suddenly dry. "Thanks, Josh. Oh, I'll keep that in mind." She left, her heart pounding as she walked back to her house, feeling a strange mix of exhilaration and guilt that she couldn't quite shake. Once inside, she locked the door, leaning against it as she tried to calm the racing of her pulse. It was silly, she told herself. Just a neighborly favor. But the memory of his touch lingered, leaving her with a feeling she hadn't experienced in a long time, a feeling she couldn't quite name but didn't want to forget. The next morning dawned quietly, the sun casting soft light through the kitchen window as Sarah stood making coffee. She watched the dark liquid drip slowly into the carafe, her mind still lingering on the events of the night before. It was ridiculous, really, she told herself. Helping Josh with his cabinet was just a neighborly thing to do. But it wasn't the simple favor that left her feeling unsettled. It was everything else, the unexpected thrill, the way her heart raced, the way she felt noticed in a way she hadn't in years. She tried to shake it off, but it was almost impossible. Mark had already left early for work, just as he did every weekday morning, leaving her with the quiet of the house and her scattered thoughts. Their marriage had settled into such a steady rhythm over the years that she often felt like a background character in her own life. Mark had his career and goals, and she had her routines, each predictable as the sunrise. As she sipped her coffee, she thought about the way Josh had looked at her, the softness in his eyes as high as he'd thanked her. It wasn't even anything explicit, just a look, a subtle moment that had left her feeling seen. She realized with a pang that she hadn't felt that way in a long time. For years, she had dismissed the quiet longing that occasionally crept into her heart, the feeling that maybe, just maybe, there was something missing. But last night, it had surfaced again, clearer and sharper than ever. Pushing the thought away, Sarah grabbed her purse and keys, heading out to run errands. She had a long list of things to get done, and losing herself in the usual humdrum of groceries and chores would surely put an end to these foolish thoughts. The day passed in a blur of small, mundane tasks, but Josh's image lingered at the back of her mind, a shadow she couldn't quite shake. It wasn't until she returned home in the afternoon, carrying bags of groceries, that she spotted him again. He was out in his front yard, pulling weeds by the flower bed that bordered his driveway. His shirt clung to his back in the midday heat, and she found herself watching him, unable to look away. She hadn't realized he'd noticed her until he stood up, wiping the sweat from his forehead and giving her a casual wave. Caught, she waved back, feeling a blush creep up her neck as he walked over. "Hey, Sarah," he greeted her, flashing that easy smile. "How's your day going?" "Oh, just the usual," she replied, holding up the grocery bags, stocking up on the essentials. He chuckled, nodding toward the bags. "Need a hand with those?" For a moment she considered saying no, making some polite excuse. But instead she found herself saying, "Actually, that would be great. Thanks." Together they walked toward her front door, Josh taking a few bags from her arms, his fingertips brushing against her hand in the process. It was such a small thing, a casual touch, but it made her pulse quicken. She unlocked the door and led him inside, gesturing toward the kitchen counter where he set down the bags. "Thanks again," she said, smiling a little too brightly. "You really didn't have to help." "Hey, it's the least I could do," he replied, leaning casually against the counter. "Besides, it's good to have an excuse to get out of the sun for a minute." Sarah glanced out the window, noticing the heat shimmering off the pavement. "It's brutal out there," she agreed, opening one of the bags and starting to unpack. She felt his gaze on her, and it made her hands feel clumsy, self-conscious. She tried to keep her tone light as she put away a box of pasta. "How's the cabinet holding up?" "Good as new," he replied, a hint of admiration in his voice. "You've got a talent for fixing things." She laughed, brushing it off. "I wouldn't go that far. I'm just used to making do with what we have." His eyes held a softness as he watched her, a look that seemed to see past her words, past her defenses. "Not everyone would come over after dark to help a neighbor out," he said, his voice low. "You're different, Sarah. In a good way." Her heart skipped a beat, her hands pausing mid-motion. She looked at him, surprised, and saw something in his expression she hadn't seen before, a mix of curiosity and something else. Something she couldn't quite name but felt with startling clarity. "Different?" she echoed, trying to keep her voice steady. He nodded, taking a small step closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "Yeah, there's just something about you. You're not like everyone else around here." A silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words and mutual understanding. She felt a thrill run down her spine, a strange, undeniable connection that made her pulse race. She wanted to say something, to deflect or brush it off, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she found herself rooted to the spot, unable to look away. Finally, as if sensing the tension, Josh stepped back, breaking the spell. "I should get going," he said, his tone softer. "But let me know if you need help with anything." "I mean it." She nodded, feeling strangely breathless. "Thank you, Josh. Really." He lingered a moment longer, his gaze holding hers before he turned and headed toward the door. She watched him go, a mix of relief and disappointment flooding her as he stepped outside and disappeared down the path. Once he was gone, she let out a shaky breath, realizing she'd been holding it in. Alone again, Sarah sank onto a bar stool, trying to process the strange, electrifying feeling that had washed over her. It was just a conversation, she told herself. Just a friendly exchange. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. She felt it in her bones, a simmering tension that defied explanation. And as much as she wanted to push it away, to return to her usual routine, she couldn't ignore the way he'd made her feel alive, seen, wanted. That evening, as she prepared dinner for herself, her thoughts kept drifting back to Josh. She tried to focus on chopping vegetables, on the gentle hiss of oil in the pan, but her mind was restless. She imagined his hand brushing against hers, the quiet strength in his voice, the way he'd looked at her with such intensity. It was intoxicating, unsettling, and deeply confusing. When Mark came home later, exhausted and distracted, he barely noticed the meal she'd prepared. He mumbled a quick thanks, his eyes glued to his phone, scrolling through emails. They ate in silence, as they often did, exchanging only brief comments about their day. And as she sat across from him, watching him scroll through work messages, she couldn't help but feel the vast distance between them, a distance that seemed to grow wider with each passing day. That night, after Mark had gone to bed, Sarah lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Her mind was a whirlwind, her thoughts a tangled mess of emotions she didn't know how to untangle. She thought of her life, her marriage, the steady predictability she'd always taken comfort in. And yet, as comforting as it was, it now felt confining, like a box she'd outgrown but didn't know how to escape. She knew she shouldn't feel this way. She was married, committed, and her husband was a good man. But Josh had stirred something in her, something she hadn't felt in years, and it scared her how quickly she'd become captivated by him. She tried to tell herself it was just a passing feeling, that she'd forget about him in a few days, but deep down, she knew that wasn't true. As she finally drifted off to sleep, one last thought flitted through her mind, a thought that both thrilled and terrified her. What would it feel like to step outside the lines she'd so carefully drawn around her life? The days after her last conversation with Josh passed in a slow haze, each hour filled with mundane tasks that felt hollow in comparison to the thrill she'd felt around him. Every time she walked past her front door, she felt a magnetic pull toward his house across the street. She kept finding herself glancing out the window, hoping for a glimpse of him. But even as she fought to ignore her feelings, she couldn't shake the thought of him, the way he'd looked at her, the subtle brush of his hand, the way he'd made her feel alive in a way she hadn't in years. The feeling only grew stronger, and she began to look forward to her trips out of the house, wondering if she might catch him outside. She told herself it was harmless, a bit of innocent excitement to break up the monotony of her life. But the thrill, the nervous flutter she felt whenever she saw him, told a different story. On the third evening after their last encounter, she finally saw him again. She had just come home from running errands and was unloading groceries when she spotted him walking up the driveway, a casual smile on his face. Her heart skipped a beat, and she struggled to keep her face calm as he approached. "Hey, Sarah," he said, his tone warm and familiar. "Hey, Josh." She smiled, hoping it didn't show just how much she'd been looking forward to seeing him. "How's it going?" "Not bad, just trying to keep busy," he replied. His eyes lingered on her, a soft warmth in his gaze. "Actually, I was wondering if you might be free this evening?" Her heart leaped, and she tried to keep her voice steady. "Oh, what's up?" He glanced down almost shyly before meeting her gaze again. "I thought I'd make dinner. I figured, to say thank you for helping me with the cabinet. You probably haven't had a night off in a while, and I thought maybe you'd like some company." The invitation hung in the air between them, and Sarah's mind raced. Every logical part of her told her she should decline. It was risky, too close to crossing a line she wasn't sure she wanted to cross, but the idea of spending an evening with him, away from the routine of her life, felt irresistible. The thought of sitting across from him, sharing a meal, talking and laughing, it felt like a lifeline. She forced herself to breathe, nodding slowly. "That sounds nice. What time?" 7? He suggested, his smile growing. "Just a casual thing. You don't need to bring anything, just yourself." 7 it is, she replied, feeling a thrill course through her at the words. They exchanged a few more pleasantries before he walked back to his house, leaving her standing in her driveway, feeling as if she'd just agreed to something forbidden, something thrilling and dangerously exciting. All afternoon, Sarah couldn't shake the nervous energy bubbling inside her. She told herself it was just dinner, just a neighborly meal. But the excitement she felt was anything but ordinary. As she stood in front of her closet, sifting through her clothes, she realized she was putting far too much thought into what to wear. She settled on a simple dress, nothing too fancy but enough to make her feel a bit more like herself. She added a touch of makeup, something she hadn't done in a while, and brushed her hair with a little more care. As she looked in the mirror, she felt a strange sense of satisfaction, a reminder of a side of herself she'd almost forgotten, a part of her that wanted to feel noticed, desired. By the time 7:00 rolled around, she felt a strange mixture of nerves and anticipation as she walked across the street to his house. The sun was just setting, casting a warm, golden light over the neighborhood, and she took a deep breath to steady herself before knocking on his door. Josh opened it almost immediately, as if he'd been waiting for her. His smile was warm, welcoming, and for a moment she forgot all her nerves, lost in the easy comfort of his presence. "Come on in," he said, stepping aside to let her in. She stepped inside, glancing around. The house was cozy, with soft lighting and the faint smell of something delicious wafting from the kitchen. He'd set the dining table with a simple elegance, a candle flickering in the center, casting a soft glow over the room. "This looks amazing," she said, genuinely touched by the effort he'd put into everything. He shrugged, looking a little embarrassed. "It's just pasta, nothing fancy. I figured it was better to keep things simple." They moved to the table, and Josh poured them each a glass of wine before joining her. The meal was simple, as he'd promised, but as they ate, Sarah found herself drawn into easy conversation, her worries and anxieties melting away. They talked about everything and nothing, from stories about his childhood to her frustrations with her part-time job. With each glass of wine, her laughter came more freely, and she found herself feeling lighter, unburdened. For the first time in a long while, she felt truly present, immersed in the moment, not worrying about tomorrow or the choices she'd made. And Josh seemed to understand her in a way that was both comforting and exhilarating, as if he saw beyond the polite exterior she'd worn for so long. At one point, as they laughed over a story about his first disastrous attempt at cooking, their hands brushed on the table, and the laughter faded into a charged silence. Her heart raced, and she glanced down, feeling her cheeks warm as their fingers lingered together for a beat too long. "Sarah," he murmured, his voice soft, filled with an emotion she couldn't quite name. She looked up, meeting his gaze, and felt something shift in the air between them, a silent acknowledgement of the connection they both felt but hadn't spoken aloud. She knew she should pull her hand back, break the moment, say something to dispel the tension, but she couldn't bring herself to move, caught in the warmth of his gaze. For a brief, wild moment, she wanted to lean in, to cross the distance between them, and feel his lips on hers. The thought was intoxicating, a forbidden thrill that made her pulse quicken. But just as she felt herself leaning forward, the sound of her phone buzzing in her bag snapped her back to reality. She pulled her hand away quickly, her heart pounding as she reached for her phone. The screen lit up with a message from Mark, a simple "Hey, just checking in. Love you." The words were like a bucket of cold water, bringing her back to reality. She could feel Josh's eyes on her, a quiet understanding in his expression as she put the phone away. I should probably get going," she said softly, a wave of guilt crashing over her as the weight of what she'd almost done settled on her shoulders. Josh nodded, his expression unreadable. "I understand." They walked to the door in silence, the warmth of the evening replaced by a tension she couldn't quite name. As she stepped outside, she turned to look at him one last time, trying to find the words to thank him, to explain the complicated mix of emotions swirling inside her. "Thank you, Josh, for everything," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. His smile was gentle, almost sad. "Anytime, Sarah. I mean it." As she walked back across the street to her house, she felt a strange emptiness settle over her, a sense of loss that left her feeling hollow and raw. She tried to push it away, telling herself it was just dinner, just a friendly meal. But the memory of his touch, his gaze, lingered, a reminder of a connection she couldn't ignore, no matter how hard she tried. When she finally slipped into bed that night, Mark already fast asleep beside her, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, haunted by the thought of what could have been, and by the realization that, for the first time, she wasn't sure what she wanted. The days following their dinner left Sarah in a fog of emotions she couldn't shake. Her life continued as usual, morning coffee, errands, afternoons scrolling through social media, and evenings in front of the television with Mark, though he often remained buried in his work emails. But a part of her mind kept wandering back to that evening with Josh, the warmth of his home, the soft laughter that filled the room, and that fleeting touch that had ignited a fire she thought had long been extinguished. Every time she thought about it, she felt a pang of guilt. She was married, after all, and she knew where her boundaries should be. But there was something about Josh that called to her, a magnetic pull that made it impossible to ignore her attraction. It wasn't just his presence, his gaze, or his smile. It was the way he seemed to see right through her, to the parts of her she herself had almost forgotten. When she was with him, she felt like a different person, someone freer and more alive. One evening, a few days after their dinner, Sarah found herself outside in her backyard, trying to clear her mind. The sky was a deep blue, the last remnants of sunlight casting long shadows across the grass. She breathed in the cool evening air, feeling the tension in her shoulders ease, if only slightly. But as she stood there, her thoughts drifted back to Josh, and she wondered if he was home, if he was thinking about her too. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she pulled it out, half expecting it to be a message from Mark, reminding her of something mundane. But her heart skipped a beat when she saw Josh's name on the screen. "Are you free? Could use some help with another project," the message read. Sarah hesitated, her heart pounding. She knew she should say no, that going back to his house would only make things more complicated, but the allure of spending another evening with him, of escaping the dull routine of her life, was too tempting to resist. Before she could talk herself out of it, she typed back a quick reply. "Sure, what time?" The reply came almost immediately. "How about now? It's just a small thing in the garage, won't take long." She glanced back at her house, knowing Mark wouldn't be home for a few more hours. "Be right over," she typed, a thrill of anticipation rushing through her as she hit send. Walking across the street to Josh's house felt both familiar and strangely surreal. This time there was no pretense of helping him with groceries or a casual chat in the driveway. This time she knew exactly why she was going, and she couldn't deny the excitement bubbling inside her. He opened the door as she approached, greeting her with that warm smile she'd come to recognize. She noticed he looked a little more relaxed this evening, dressed in a worn t-shirt and jeans, a casual look that only seemed to make him more appealing. "Hey, Sarah. Thanks for coming," he said, his voice soft. "Of course," she replied, stepping inside. "What's the project?" He led her into the garage where a small shelf lay on the floor, partially assembled. "It's this," he explained, his tone light, almost playful. "I thought it would be a quick fix. But it turns out I'm more useless at this stuff than I realized." She laughed, kneeling down beside the shelf to examine it. "Well, you called the right person," she teased. "Hand me that screwdriver." He complied, crouching down beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. They worked side by side, sharing small talk and quiet laughter as they tightened screws and aligned panels. But with every touch, every brush of his hand, the charged silence between them grew more palpable, a tension simmering just below the surface. Finally, the last screw was in place, and she sat back, admiring their handiwork. "There. I think that'll hold." Josh nodded, but his gaze lingered on her rather than the shelf. "Thanks, Sarah. You're a lifesaver." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with an unspoken understanding neither of them wanted to acknowledge. Sarah's heart pounded, and she felt her breath hitch as he reached out, his fingers brushing a stray hair from her cheek. The touch was gentle, lingering, and when she looked up, she saw something in his eyes that made her pulse quicken. They were so close, his hand still resting against her cheek, his thumb lightly tracing her skin. She knew she should pull back, break the moment before it went too far. But she couldn't bring herself to move. Instead, she found herself leaning into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut as his hand slid to the back of her neck, drawing her closer. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice barely above a breath. Her heart raced as he leaned in, his lips inches from hers. She could feel his breath on her skin, warm and inviting, and in that moment, every thought, every hesitation melted away. She closed the distance, her lips meeting his in a kiss that was soft at first, tentative, but quickly grew deeper, fueled by the desire that had been simmering between them for so long. The world around her faded, and all she could feel was him, his hand in her hair, the warmth of his body against hers, the taste of his lips. It was everything she'd tried to ignore, every unspoken feeling brought to life, and she felt herself getting lost in him, surrendering to the thrill of the moment. After a long, breathless moment, they pulled apart, their foreheads touching as they struggled to catch their breath. She looked up at him, a mix of excitement and guilt swirling in her chest as she tried to process what had just happened. I shouldn't have, she began, her voice shaky. But Josh shook his head, his gaze intense. No, Sarah, don't apologize. I know this is complicated, but I don't regret it. His words sent a shiver down her spine, and she felt her defenses start to crumble. The walls she'd built around her marriage and her life slipping away. She wanted to say something, to explain the turmoil inside her, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, they sat there in silence, her hand still resting on his arm, the connection between them undeniable, and in that moment she realized there was no turning back. She couldn't deny what she felt any longer, couldn't pretend that this attraction was something she could ignore. After a few minutes, Josh pulled away slightly, his expression soft. I don't want to pressure you, Sarah. I know you have a life, a marriage, but if there's any part of you that wants this, that feels what I feel, then I'm here. No expectations, no demands. His words were gentle, understanding, and she felt a wave of gratitude wash over her, mixed with the guilt and desire that had been building inside her for days. She took a deep breath, her mind racing as she tried to make sense of everything. But all she knew was that the pull toward him was stronger than anything she'd ever felt. I don't know what I want, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. But I know I can't ignore this. He nodded, his hands sliding down to hers, their fingers intertwining as he offered a reassuring squeeze. Then let's take it slow. No pressure. Just see where this goes. His words were a lifeline, a way forward that didn't demand decisions or commitments, just a chance to explore the feelings that had taken root in her heart. She nodded, a small smile breaking through the confusion as she looked up at him, feeling a glimmer of hope amidst the chaos. Okay, she whispered, her voice steady. They sat there, hand in hand, the silence between them comfortable, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of peace. It was complicated, messy, and forbidden, but in that moment, none of it mattered. All that mattered was the way he made her feel alive, seen, and wanted. As she walked back to her house later that night, her heart still racing, she knew her life had changed in ways she couldn't fully understand. She had stepped outside the lines of her marriage, crossed a boundary she never thought she would. And yet, as she lay in bed that night, replaying every stolen glance, every whispered word, she couldn't bring herself to regret it. For the first time in years, she felt truly alive, and even though she knew there would be consequences, she wasn't ready to let go of that feeling. Not yet. In the days that followed, Sarah's world felt as though it were suspended in a delicate, secretive balance. Each time she left her house, each time she checked her phone, her pulse would quicken with the thought of Josh, the weight of what they'd shared filling her with equal parts exhilaration and guilt. It was as if she was living in two worlds, one, the life she'd always known, and another that felt like it had been waiting for her all along, hidden just below the surface. She told herself it would be the last time, but each time they met, each brush of his hand, each stolen kiss, only left her wanting more. They began meeting more often, slipping into each other's lives under the cover of darkness, each encounter as thrilling and forbidden as the first. Her marriage with Mark, which had once been the center of her world, now felt like a shadow, a distant echo of a life she'd been pretending to live. One evening, after Mark had left for another business trip, Sarah found herself in front of her bedroom mirror, scrutinizing her reflection with an intensity she hadn't felt in years. The face staring back at her was familiar, yet different. Her eyes seemed brighter, her cheeks flushed. She looked alive, almost younger, as if the hidden parts of herself had been coaxed back to life by this secret part of her existence. Her phone buzzed, breaking the quiet. She grabbed it, heart racing as she read the message from Josh. Meet me at the old park tonight? 8? She took a deep breath, her fingers hovering over the screen as her mind raced. Every part of her knew she should say no, that this was reckless and dangerous, and yet she couldn't stop herself from replying, I'll be there. When she arrived at the park that night, dusk was settling, casting the familiar playground in shades of purple and blue. She walked through the winding path, the trees casting shadows that seemed to reach out like hidden fingers. The park was quiet, empty at this hour, with only the soft chirping of crickets breaking the silence. She hadn't set foot in this place since she was a teenager, and being there with Josh now felt both surreal and thrilling. He was waiting by the swings, his figure silhouetted against the darkening sky. As she approached, he turned, his face breaking into a smile that made her heart leap. She walked over to him, her pulse quickening as he took her hand, pulling her close without a word. They stood there, wrapped in the stillness of the night, a silence that spoke louder than anything they could say. Without thinking, she leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder, letting the comfort of his embrace wash over her. He held her tightly, his hand stroking her back in gentle, reassuring circles. It was the kind of touch she'd forgotten she could feel, the kind of warmth that she'd longed for but had never truly allowed herself to seek. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice breaking the stillness. She looked up, her eyes meeting his in the dim light, and saw a softness there that made her heart ache. "I don't want to complicate things. I know this isn't easy for you." She swallowed, feeling the weight of his words settle over her. "I know it's complicated," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. "But I don't want to stop. I can't go back to how things were before." His hand moved to her face, his thumb brushing gently across her cheek. "You deserve to feel this way, Sarah," he murmured. "You deserve to be happy." The words sank deep into her, stirring something she'd kept hidden for so long, a longing, a desire to be seen, to be loved in a way that went beyond the routines and responsibilities of her life. She didn't reply, but her silence seemed to speak for her as she leaned in, pressing her lips to his in a kiss that held every unspoken feeling she'd been carrying. Their kiss deepened, and the world around them seemed to fade away, leaving only the quiet rhythm of their breath, the warmth of his arms around her. She felt herself melting into him, surrendering to the moment, letting go of everything else. For the first time, she allowed herself to be entirely in the present, unburdened by the weight of guilt or fear. He pulled back slightly, his forehead resting against hers, his breath warm against her skin. "Come with me," he whispered, his voice low, inviting. She nodded, her heart pounding, as he took her hand and led her down the path, past the playground, and toward the small grove of trees that lined the park. The air was filled with the earthy scent of grass and pine, and the canopy above them was thick enough to cast them in darkness, shielding them from the world. They stopped under a large oak tree, and he turned to her, his eyes filled with a longing that mirrored her own. Without a word, he pulled her close, their bodies pressed together as they found each other in the darkness, their kisses growing deeper, more urgent. Every touch, every whisper, felt like an escape, a release from the constraints of her life. She knew it was wrong, but the thrill of it, the rush of being with him, drowned out every hesitation. As the night deepened, they lay together beneath the tree, wrapped in each other's arms, their breathing slow and steady. The stars above them glittered through the branches, casting a soft glow over the grove. She traced patterns on his arm, feeling a strange sense of peace settle over her, a quiet contentment that filled the empty spaces she'd carried for so long. "Do you ever think about what might have been?" she asked, her voice soft in the silence. Josh shifted, propping himself up on his elbow to look down at her. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but I also think about what could be. I think about what you deserve, Sarah. I think about what you could have." His words lingered in the air, heavy with meaning, and she felt a pang of something close to sadness. The reality of what she was doing, the impossibility of it all, hung over her like a shadow, a reminder of the life she'd left behind, just to be with him for a few stolen hours. "I don't know what I deserve," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "But I know that I feel more alive with you than I have in years. I don't know what that means or what I'm supposed to do about it." Josh brushed a strand of hair from her face, his gaze soft. "You don't have to figure it out right now. We don't have to make any promises. I just want you to be happy. Even if it's just for a moment, even if it's just here." She closed her eyes, letting his words sink in. He was right, they didn't have to have all the answers. didn't have to know where this would lead. All she knew was that she wanted to hold on to this feeling for as long as she could, to savor every stolen moment with him. They lay together in the quiet of the grove, the weight of the night pressing down on them, each breath a reminder of the forbidden nature of their connection. And yet, in that space, in the darkness and solitude, Sarah felt something she hadn't felt in years: freedom. As they finally parted and she walked back to her house, her heart heavy with the weight of their secret, she knew that her life had crossed a threshold, that she could never return to the way things were before. She had stepped into a new world, one where desire and consequence coexisted, a world where she was both bound and liberated. And though she didn't know where it would lead, one thing was certain: she couldn't and wouldn't turn back. After that night in the park, Sarah and Josh's relationship deepened into a series of clandestine encounters, hidden from the prying eyes of their neighborhood and, most importantly, from Mark. Their worlds had now intertwined in ways that felt both intoxicating and terrifying, leaving her straddling a life of hidden passion and a life of quiet, familiar routine. With Mark away more frequently for work, Sarah found herself slipping into Josh's orbit with increasing ease. Their meetings were planned in subtle, unspoken ways, a single text message sent just as dusk settled, or an innocuous wave across the street that held a promise only the two of them understood. They met in quiet places: the park after dark, a trail in the nearby woods, even the narrow alley between their houses when the timing allowed. Every encounter was charged, a stolen moment that broke through the mundane predictability of her daily life. One Friday afternoon, while she was out running errands, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She checked it, her heart skipping a beat as she read Josh's message. "Come over later. There's something I want to show you." A rush of excitement bloomed in her chest, tempered only slightly by the familiar pang of guilt. But she was too far gone to let guilt hold her back now. Her desire for him, for the thrill and freedom he offered, was too strong. She replied with a quick "I'll be there," and finished her errands with a nervous anticipation that made her feel like a teenager sneaking out for the first time. That evening, just as the sky began to deepen into a dark blue twilight, Sarah slipped out of her house and made her way across the street to Josh's. Her hands were clammy, her heart pounding with both anticipation and fear of being seen. But the moment he opened the door and she saw his warm, inviting smile, every worry melted away. In his presence, she felt free, unburdened by the expectations and responsibilities that weighed her down at home. Josh led her into the house and took her hand, guiding her toward the back of his home. He paused at a door she hadn't noticed before, a narrow, unassuming door that led down a flight of stairs. He glanced back at her, a playful smile dancing on his lips. "I've been working on a little project," he said, his voice soft. "Thought you might like to see it." Curiosity piqued, she followed him down the stairs into a basement she hadn't known existed. When they reached the bottom, she looked around in awe. The basement had been transformed into a cozy, almost magical hideaway. Soft, ambient lights cast a warm glow over the space, illuminating shelves lined with books, a small, plush couch, and a few scattered paintings that gave the room a sense of quiet intimacy. "It's amazing," she whispered, her eyes wide as she took it all in. "I had no idea you had this down here." He shrugged, a modest smile playing on his lips. "I like my privacy, and I thought maybe you could use a place to escape to once in a while." The thoughtfulness of his gesture left her breathless, and she looked up at him, overwhelmed by a surge of gratitude and affection. "Thank you, Josh. This means more than you know." Without another word, he closed the distance between them, his hands finding her waist as he pulled her close. Their lips met in a kiss that was soft and tender, a moment of stillness in the whirlwind of their lives. For the first time, she felt as though they were in their own world, a space untouched by the demands and constraints of the outside. Here, in this hidden room, they were free to be themselves, unburdened by judgment or consequence. As they settled onto the couch, the intimacy between them deepened, their touches growing bolder, their breaths mingling in the quiet darkness. They whispered to each other, sharing secrets and dreams, letting themselves be vulnerable in ways they hadn't allowed before. He told her about his childhood, the places he'd dreamed of traveling to, the moments that had shaped him. And she found herself opening up too, revealing parts of herself that she'd hidden from everyone, even Mark. "I always thought I had it all figured out," she murmured, her head resting on his chest as he ran his fingers through her hair. "But now, I don't know what I want anymore." He kissed her forehead, his touch gentle, understanding. "Sometimes we don't know until something shakes us awake," he replied softly. "Sometimes we need to lose ourselves a little to figure out what really matters." They lay there for hours, wrapped in each other's arms, drifting between conversation and comfortable silence. Time seemed to slow down, the world outside fading into insignificance. She felt a warmth, a peace, that she hadn't felt in years, a sense of belonging she hadn't realized she was missing. With Josh, she could let her guard down, be honest with herself in a way that felt liberating, if a little frightening. When the night grew late, and the soft glow of dawn began to touch the edges of the sky, they reluctantly parted. She knew she had to go back, to return to the world that awaited her, but leaving him felt like tearing away a piece of herself. Standing at his door, she hesitated, a lump forming in her throat. "Thank you, Josh," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "For tonight, for everything." He pulled her into one last embrace, his arms warm and comforting around her. "Anytime, Sarah," he murmured, his voice steady. "I'm here, whenever you need." She left, crossing the street with a bittersweet ache in her chest, her heart heavy with the weight of the choices she'd made. Back in her own home, she crept into bed beside Mark, who was still sound asleep, oblivious to the turmoil churning inside her. She lay there in the quiet darkness, feeling the familiar pull of guilt settle over her, mingling with the memories of the night she'd just shared with Josh. Days turned into weeks, and their meetings became a quiet routine, a secret rhythm that wove itself into the fabric of her life. They stole moments whenever they could, a shared glance across the street, a brief touch as they passed each other on the way to their cars, an embrace behind the closed doors of his basement hideaway. Each encounter left her craving more, the thrill of their forbidden relationship addictive in a way she hadn't anticipated. But as their connection deepened, so did the risk. She found herself lying to Mark more often, inventing reasons to leave the house, to slip away under the guise of errands or an evening walk. Her heart raced with fear every time she left, the knowledge that one misstep could unravel everything weighing heavily on her. And yet, she couldn't bring herself to stop. The thought of ending things with Josh felt unbearable, the emptiness of a life without him too much to face. In moments of quiet reflection, she wondered how long they could keep this up, how long they could continue this delicate balancing act before something gave. She knew, deep down, that the life she was living was unsustainable, that the lies and secrets were a fragile web that could shatter at any moment. But the thought of giving him up, of returning to the life she'd had before, was something she couldn't bring herself to imagine. And so, she continued, caught between two worlds, bound by the thrill and freedom Josh offered, yet tethered to the life she'd built with Mark. She didn't know where it would lead, or how it would end, but for now, she was willing to risk it all, to keep crossing the line, to hold on to the forbidden love that had come to define her in ways she never thought possible. It was supposed to be a simple evening. Sarah had carefully planned everything, as she always did, making sure there were no loose ends, no lingering traces of her secret life with Josh. Mark had been working later than usual, leaving her ample time to slip away and spend a few hours in the warm sanctuary of Josh's basement hideaway. It had become their haven, a place where the world outside didn't exist, where they could pretend they were just two people in love, free from the expectations and responsibilities that normally bound them. But that night, as she lay beside Josh, her head resting on his chest, a knot of anxiety began to form in her stomach. The sound of her phone buzzing interrupted the quiet, and she felt a chill run through her as she glanced down to see Mark's name flashing on the screen. She froze, her heart hammering in her chest as she reached for the phone, hoping it was just a routine message. "Hey Sarah, just finished up. I'm going to grab some dinner, and I should be home by 9. the message read. Her heart dropped. 9 o'clock was only 30 minutes away, and it would take at least 15 to walk back across the street without raising suspicion. She felt Josh's hand on her back, warm and reassuring, and she looked up at him, her eyes filled with panic. "Mark's on his way home," she whispered, her voice trembling. Josh's brow furrowed, and he gave her a small, understanding nod. "You'd better get going," he said softly, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. She sat up, hurriedly smoothing out her dress, trying to compose herself even as her mind raced with panic. Every second felt like a countdown, the weight of her choices pressing down on her, as she struggled to remember every detail, every precaution she needed to take. "I'm sorry," she murmured, feeling a pang of guilt for the abrupt ending to their evening. "Don't be," he replied, reaching out to squeeze her hand. "Go. Be careful." She forced a small smile, her heart aching as she turned, and made her way up the stairs, every step filled with a mixture of fear and longing. She slipped out the back door, glancing around to ensure no one was watching, before making her way across the darkened lawn. The street was empty, quiet in the stillness of the night, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that every step was being scrutinized by invisible eyes. When she reached her house, she let out a shaky breath, carefully unlocking the door and slipping inside. She took a moment to steady herself, brushing a hand through her hair and checking her reflection in the hall mirror. Her face was flushed, her eyes bright with adrenaline, and she took a deep breath, willing herself to appear calm and collected. The sound of the front door opening snapped her out of her thoughts, and she quickly turned, forcing a smile as Mark stepped inside. He looked tired, his face drawn from the long day, and she felt a pang of guilt as she watched him set his keys down on the entryway table. "Hey, you're still up," he said, a faint smile crossing his lips as he walked over to her. He leaned down, pressing a quick kiss to her forehead, and she tried to suppress the guilt that tightened in her chest. "Yeah, I couldn't sleep," she replied, hoping her voice sounded steady. He nodded, oblivious to her turmoil, and made his way to the kitchen to pour himself a glass of water. She followed, watching him from a distance, her mind racing with thoughts of what might have happened if he'd come home just a few minutes earlier. She knew she was playing a dangerous game, that every encounter with Josh brought her closer to discovery, yet she couldn't bring herself to stop. As they settled into their usual evening routine, him checking emails, her pretending to read a book, weight of her secret felt heavier than ever. She'd always managed to keep her two lives separate, to compartmentalize her feelings, but tonight, the walls between them felt thinner, more fragile, as if they could crumble with the slightest touch. A few days later, as if the universe sensed her inner turmoil, something happened that pushed everything to the edge. It was a Sunday afternoon, and Sarah had just returned from running errands when she saw Josh standing in his front yard, talking to a woman she didn't recognize. The woman was tall, with dark hair and an air of confidence that made Sarah's heart sink. She watched from her window, feeling a wave of jealousy rise within her as she tried to make sense of the scene. The woman laughed at something Josh said, touching his arm in a way that felt too familiar, too intimate. Sarah clenched her fists, torn between anger and insecurity as she watched them. She knew it was irrational, that she had no right to feel possessive, but the sight of him with someone else stirred a deep, unexpected ache within her. That night, she couldn't sleep. Her mind was a whirlwind of doubts and fears, questions she hadn't dared to ask herself until now. What did she really mean to Josh? Was she just an escape, a thrill? Or did he feel the same intensity, the same connection that she did? The next day, she sent him a message, asking if they could meet. He replied with a simple "of course," and they arranged to meet in his basement hideaway that evening, just as the sun began to set. When she arrived, he greeted her with a warm smile, but she couldn't bring herself to return it. She felt vulnerable, exposed, the uncertainty of their relationship weighing on her more heavily than ever. "Who was she?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Josh looked at her, surprised. "Who?" "The woman I saw you with yesterday. In your front yard." Realization dawned on his face, and he gave a small chuckle, shaking his head. Sarah, that was my sister. She was just stopping by on her way back from a work trip. Relief washed over her, and she felt a wave of embarrassment at her own jealousy. But beneath the relief, a new worry took root, the realization that her feelings for him ran deeper than she'd wanted to admit. I'm sorry, she murmured, looking away. I shouldn't have, He took her hands, pulling her close, his gaze steady and reassuring. Sarah, I get it. This isn't easy for either of us. She looked up at him, her heart aching with the intensity of her emotions. Josh, I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this, she whispered. Every time I lie to Mark, every time I sneak out to be with you, I feel like I'm being torn in two. His expression softened, and he reached up to brush a strand of hair from her face. Then don't, he said, his voice gentle but firm. You don't have to keep living this double life, Sarah. You deserve more than this. The words lingered in the air, a quiet invitation to a future she couldn't quite envision. She knew what he was suggesting, the possibility of leaving Mark, of choosing a life with him instead. But the thought filled her with fear, the weight of the consequences pressing down on her. What if I can't? She murmured, her voice trembling. Then we keep going as we are, he replied, his voice steady. But I'll be here, Sarah. Whatever you decide, I'm not going anywhere. She felt tears prick her eyes, overwhelmed by the choice before her, the impossible decision between the life she'd built and the love she'd found. She knew she couldn't keep going like this, that something had to give. But for now, as she leaned into his embrace, she allowed herself to forget the future, to live in the moment and hold on to the love she knew would change her life forever. As they parted that night, her heart heavy with the weight of her decision, she knew that her life had reached a turning point. She could no longer ignore the path she was on, the choice that lay before her. And as she walked back to her house, the quiet resolve settling over her, she knew that, whatever came next, there was no going back. The days following Sarah's conversation with Josh were filled with an intense, consuming tension. Each moment she spent with Mark felt like a lie stretched thin, a thread ready to snap with the slightest pull. She knew the life she had carefully constructed was unraveling, that she could no longer live between two worlds. The weight of her choices pressed down on her, pushing her toward an inevitable decision she both feared and needed. On a quiet Wednesday evening, Mark came home earlier than usual, his brow furrowed, eyes dark with something she couldn't quite place. He set down his briefcase, looking at her in a way he hadn't in a long time, a searching, almost knowing look that sent a chill through her. She tried to keep her expression calm, to mask the fear rising within her, but his gaze felt like it could see through every carefully crafted facade. Sarah, we need to talk, he said, his voice measured, controlled. She felt her pulse quicken, a sense of foreboding filling the room. Okay, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper as she sat down on the couch, bracing herself for what she knew was coming. He took a deep breath, his eyes never leaving hers. I've noticed things have been different lately, he began, his voice steady, but there was a slight tremor there, a vulnerability she hadn't heard in years. You've been distant, Sarah, and I can't keep pretending that I don't know why. Her heart pounded as the words she'd feared finally broke the surface, the truth looming between them like a shadow. She looked down, unable to meet his gaze, the guilt she'd been carrying now crushing her under its weight. Mark, she whispered, her voice trembling. Is it him? He asked, his voice barely concealing the hurt. Josh? The silence in the room was deafening, and she felt her chest tighten as the truth, long hidden, now lay exposed between them. She could no longer pretend, no longer hide behind half-truths and excuses. She looked up, meeting his gaze, her eyes filling with tears as she finally spoke the words that had haunted her for so long. Yes, she whispered, her voice breaking. I'm so sorry, Mark. I never meant for it to happen. I never wanted to hurt you. He took a step back, his face etched with pain, the rawness of betrayal clear in his eyes. He looked away, running a hand through his hair as he struggled to compose himself. The silence between them was heavy, a chasm that felt impossible to bridge. How long? He asked, his voice thick with emotion. She swallowed, feeling the shame settle over her. A few months, she admitted, the words tasting bitter on her tongue. It just happened. I didn't plan it. I didn't. But you kept doing it, he cut in, his voice harsh. You kept lying to me. Sneaking around. Do you even know what this does to me, Sarah? Tears spilled down her cheeks as she nodded, her chest aching with the weight of his pain. A pain she had caused. I know, Mark. I know. And I hate myself for it. I hate that I've hurt you like this. He sat down across from her, his shoulders slumped, defeated. For a long moment they sat in silence, the enormity of the moment settling between them. She wanted to reach out to comfort him, but she knew that nothing she could say or do would take away the hurt she had caused. Why, Sarah? He asked finally, his voice breaking. Why did you do this? The question lingered in the air, and she felt a pang of sorrow as she searched for the answer. The truth she'd been hiding even from herself. She took a deep breath, steadying herself, and looked at him with all the honesty she could muster. I was lost, Mark, she said softly. For a long time I felt like I was disappearing. Like I was just going through the motions, living a life that didn't feel like mine. And then Josh came along, and he made me feel alive again. He made me feel seen. I know that's not an excuse, and I know it doesn't make any of this right. But I needed to feel something. I needed to remember who I was. He looked away, his jaw clenched, and she could see the struggle in his expression as he processed her words. She knew that he would never fully understand, that no explanation could make up for the betrayal she had committed. So, what now? He asked, his voice hollow. She felt a pang of despair as she realized the gravity of the question, the finality of the choice before her. She could try to make amends, to rebuild what they'd lost, but deep down, she knew that the love she'd once had for him had changed, that the life they'd built together no longer fit the person she had become. I don't know, she replied, her voice barely audible. But I don't think we can go back to how things were. He nodded, a look of acceptance settling over him, though the pain in his eyes remained. Then maybe it's best if we let each other go, he said, his voice steady. But there was a sadness there, a sense of loss that mirrored her own. The words felt like a blow, final and unyielding, but she knew they were the truth. They couldn't go back, couldn't erase the choices they'd made or the hurt they'd caused. And though the thought of moving forward, of starting over, filled her with fear, there was a part of her that felt a quiet sense of relief. They spent the rest of the evening in silence, each lost in their own thoughts, the weight of their decision settling over them. When the morning came, they parted with quiet words and a lingering sadness, a sense of loss that would take time to heal. She watched him drive away, her heart heavy with a mixture of grief and gratitude for the life they had shared, even as it came to an end. In the days that followed, she found herself drifting, the emptiness of her home, a stark reminder of the choices she'd made. She missed the familiarity of her life with Mark, the steady comfort of his presence. But she knew that her path lay elsewhere. The life she had known was gone, and it was time to face the uncertain future ahead. One evening, as she sat alone in the quiet of her living room, her phone buzzed. She glanced down, her heart skipping a beat as she saw Josh's name on the screen. Thinking of you. Are you okay? She felt a warmth spread through her chest, a reminder of the connection that had brought her to this point. She typed a reply, her fingers trembling as she pressed send. I am. It's over with Mark. I'm free. His response came almost immediately. Can I see you? She smiled, feeling a sense of hope take root within her. A tentative promise of a new beginning. Yes, I'd like that. Later that night, as she met Josh under the familiar canopy of trees, she felt a quiet certainty settle over her. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with unknowns and challenges, but for the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of clarity, a purpose that transcended the guilt and pain of the past. They walked together, hand in hand, their steps light and unburdened, as they ventured into the unknown. And though she knew there would be days when the past weighed heavily on her, When the regret and sorrow threatened to pull her back, she also knew that she had chosen a path that was hers, a life that felt true to who she was. In the end, she realized life was about more than the choices that defined her past. It was about embracing the freedom to shape her own future, to walk forward with courage and hope, and to hold on to the love that had given her the strength to break free. And as they disappeared into the quiet of the night, Sarah felt, for the first time, like she was exactly where she was meant to be.